Ladies and gentlemen, there is a strange truth about human beings that even the most advanced algorithms struggle to fully capture. The moment a mind built for logic collides with an emotion powerful enough to rearrange its internal architecture, something entirely new emerges. I've spent decades exploring the frontier where biology meets engineering, where the human brain behaves less like a static organ and more like a constantly updating system, receptive to new inputs, shaped by memory, disrupted by trauma, and, at certain rare turning points, reprogrammed by love. And when a person who has spent their life in the pursuit of scale, efficiency, and planetary level problem solving suddenly finds themselves pulled into the gravitational field of another human being, the transformation is not subtle. It is neurological, it is chemical, it is architectural. It is, in many ways, a complete rewrite of the internal operating system. People often assume that billionaires, or anyone of enormous responsibility, are insulated from the emotional turbulence that shapes ordinary life. But the truth is the opposite. High-functioning individuals are not immune to emotion. They are often overexposed to it. Their decisions carry weight, scrutiny, and consequences magnified by global attention. The fear of misjudgment becomes sharper. The desire for stability becomes more intense. And yet the vulnerability remains the same. No amount of power, money, or technological mastery grants immunity from the human condition. If anything, it deepens the stakes, because there is more to lose, more to protect, and more that can break. Over the years, I've studied countless figures who built empires out of sheer willpower. Their brains are wired differently, not better, not worse, just tuned to a distinct frequency. They live in long-time horizons. They think in decades, not days. They optimize relentlessly. They sacrifice sleep, comfort, and sometimes entire chapters of their personal lives for a vision bigger than themselves. But even in these minds, love has a way of appearing not as a distraction, but as an unexpected upgrade. The kind of update that arrives unannounced, destabilizes the system briefly, and then rewrites the very architecture of intention. When someone like that falls in love, the shift is seismic. Not because love is rare, but because emotional intimacy demands the one thing high achievers are least accustomed to offering: surrender. Surrender of control, surrender of pace, surrender of isolated decision-making, surrender of the illusion that progress is always a solo act. And that surrender, paradoxically, often becomes the catalyst for the most profound kind of personal evolution. One of the most fascinating aspects of human attachment is its neurological signature. When a person experiences deep emotional connection, regions of the brain responsible for fear and over-analysis begin to quiet down. The amygdala's hypervigilance softens. Patterns of defensive reasoning begin to dissolve, and the prefrontal cortex, the seat of long-term planning, starts integrating this new emotional presence into its vision of the future. Love, in other words, is not merely a feeling. It is a recalibration of the brain's predictive model of reality. The moment someone becomes important to you, your entire forward-looking architecture reorganizes itself around them. Future plans shift, priorities realign, risk assessments change. Suddenly, every ambition is filtered through a new question: how does this affect us, not just me? And when the person undergoing this internal transformation is someone operating at the scale of global industries, space exploration, or breakthrough engineering, that shift isn't just personal, it ripples through everything they build. You begin to see traces of emotional evolution embedded in their work, not because love turns them away from innovation, but because it sharpens their understanding of why innovation matters in the first place. A person in love thinks more deeply about legacy, about the world their partner will live in, about the children who may inherit the consequences of today's decisions. Love makes the future feel closer, more tangible, more urgent. And urgency, when aligned with compassion, can accelerate progress in ways pure ambition never could. Despite this, people often misinterpret the silence that powerful individuals maintain around their love lives. They assume secrecy implies scandal, complications, or contradiction. But in most cases, the silence is protective, not deceptive. It emerges from an understanding that love, unlike technology, cannot be optimized under scrutiny. It needs protected space. It needs freedom from public interpretation. It needs room to breathe without algorithms predicting its trajectory or headlines reframing its meaning. The human heart was never designed to operate under a microscope, and yet in the lives of billionaires, microscopes are everywhere. The spotlight is constant. The narratives form faster than the truth can speak. So love becomes the one domain where silence is not secrecy. It is sanctuary. What fascinates me most is how relationships evolve under conditions of extreme pressure, not ordinary pressure, global pressure. Imagine waking up each day knowing that millions of people interpret your choices as signals about the direction of entire industries. Imagine balancing personal emotion with planetary responsibility. Under those conditions, the brain adapts differently. It becomes hyperlogical in some areas and hyperprotective in others. And when someone special enters that environment, the brain must find ways to integrate tenderness without compromising preparedness. This is not easy. But when it happens successfully, the result is a human being who is both stronger and softer, a combination that is rare, powerful, and transformative. I've watched this transition unfold in countless case studies. Leaders who spent decades in relentless forward motion, suddenly slowing down just enough to listen more carefully, to breathe more deeply, to consider not just the what and how of their mission, but the why. Love doesn't remove ambition, it refines it. It adds dimension. It introduces meaning that cannot be engineered, simulated, or mathematically derived. When a mind that has always been focused externally finally experiences a connection that pulls it inward, the clarity that emerges can be extraordinary. And this brings us to the hidden chapter, the one that rarely makes headlines, not because it lacks significance, but because it resists simplification. When a person of immense influence falls in love, it is not the fairy tale moment the public imagines. It is quieter, more private, more thoughtful. It unfolds not in cinematic gestures, but in the micro moments, the conversations that stretch past midnight, the shared silences that feel grounding rather than empty, the recognition of being seen without performance, the comfort of knowing that beneath the titles, the expectations, and the impossible standards, there exists someone who speaks to the most human parts of you. This chapter often begins with surprise, the kind of surprise that doesn't show up in shareholder reports or scientific journal summaries. It begins with an unexpected softness, a pull toward presence, a subtle shift in the rhythm of thought. It begins when the brain, designed to think in large-scale abstractions, suddenly becomes fascinated with the details of a single, irreplaceable human being. And from that point forward, everything changes, because love, even for someone accustomed to commanding complex systems, is an uncontrollable variable. You cannot schedule it. You cannot model it. You cannot engineer it to fit neatly within the boundaries of your professional timeline. But you can allow it to expand your perception of what is possible, not in terms of rockets or cars or planetary infrastructure, but in terms of internal evolution. And that evolution, when embraced fully, becomes the foundation of what I call emotional intelligence at scale. As we examine this hidden chapter, we see something remarkable: the way love softens the edges of high ambition without diminishing its intensity. The way it introduces tenderness into places that once relied solely on discipline. The way it rebalances a life calibrated for velocity by introducing a new dimension of depth. And the way it reminds even the most future-oriented mind that longevity is not measured only in technological milestones, but in the quality of the connections that accompany us through those milestones. When someone in a position of immense responsibility allows themselves to fully experience this depth, a fascinating neurological harmony begins to emerge. The stress centers of the brain, which are often chronically activated in high-pressure individuals, begin to regulate more efficiently. Cortisol levels stabilize, creativity increases, problem-solving becomes more associative rather than purely linear. The brain becomes more flexible, more adaptive, more capable of integrating emotional nuance into strategic decision-making. This isn't speculation. It's neuroscience. Emotional connection enhances cognitive resilience in ways no pharmaceutical or productivity strategy ever could. I've seen remarkable shifts in behavior among individuals who previously lived on the edge of burnout without ever admitting it. The moment love enters the equation, they begin to pace themselves differently. They find moments of pause in places where they previously only found deadlines. They rediscover curiosity outside of work. They allow themselves to feel pride not only in achievements but in small daily victories. A shared meal, a private joke, a moment of stillness. These small shifts may seem trivial, but they represent a profound recalibration of the brain's reward system. And once that recalibration occurs, it becomes almost impossible to return to the emotionally stripped down version of life that existed before. This is why the hidden chapter matters, because it reveals a dimension of humanity that often goes unseen in people whose lives are defined by magnitude. We tend to mythologize billionaires as pure intellect, pure drive, pure willpower. But beneath the surface, their minds are just as susceptible to wonder, attachment, and longing as anyone else. The difference is that their emotional evolution is often forced to unfold in silence, behind layers of scrutiny and misunderstanding. When they love, they do so with intensity, not because they are extreme people, but because they are used to operating at extremes. Their hearts follow the same pattern. They love with the same scale with which they innovate. Of course, this level of emotional intensity can be terrifying. For anyone who has built their identity around certainty, predictability, and control, falling in love can feel like a destabilizing force. The brain interprets vulnerability as potential threat, but what separates those who grow from those who retreat is the willingness to embrace that destabilization and let it become transformation. Vulnerability, after all, is not a weakness of the brain. It is one of its most powerful adaptive states. It is the gateway to trust, intimacy, and the kind of emotional depth that reshapes a life from the inside out. What many people don't realize is that love often arrives during the exact period when a person is least prepared for it. And this is even more true for individuals who live at the forefront of innovation. They are so deeply embedded in their mission, so consumed by responsibility, so immersed in the enormity of their goals, that emotional connection becomes something they unconsciously postpone. A chapter to be written later, once the world is fixed, once the future is secured. But love doesn't wait for the perfect moment. It appears precisely when it is needed, not when it is convenient. This timing is not accidental. Neuroscience shows us that when the brain is under long-term pressure, it seeks out sources of emotional grounding. It becomes increasingly receptive to connection. Even if the conscious mind remains focused on work, the brain quite literally begins scanning for balance. And when that balance takes the form of a person, someone who brings calm to your storms, someone who returns you to yourself, someone who asks nothing of your status and everything of your authenticity, the effect is profound. That person becomes a stabilizing presence, a reference point, a mirror, a sanctuary, the safe harbor in a world of relentless decisions and impossible expectations. And when the bond deepens, the brain begins weaving this person into its predictive architecture, not as a variable but as a constant. You stop imagining the future alone. You stop moving through the world as if everything must be carried on your shoulders. You stop believing that strength is isolation. And you start to understand something that many geniuses learn far too late, that companionship is not a distraction from purpose. It is a multiplier of purpose. The hidden chapter also reveals the truth about emotional duality. People who strive to change the world often carry private burdens that no one sees. The world applauds their achievements but overlooks their sacrifices. The loneliness that follows success is real. The isolation that comes with being responsible for large visions is real. And the distance created by constant scrutiny is real. Love becomes the antidote to that distance. It reconnects a person to their humanity. It reminds them that they are not only an architect of the future, but also a human being navigating the present. It places warmth inside a life that is otherwise dominated by velocity. And when a billionaire, someone who has spent a lifetime chasing ideas bigger than themselves, finally allows love to take root, it softens them in ways no external force ever could. They begin to laugh more freely. They begin to express themselves more openly. They allow emotions to surface that were previously filed away under layers of discipline. They rediscover playfulness. They become more patient, more empathetic, more attuned to the emotional states of those around them. They begin to move through the world not only with ambition, but with grace. There is something profoundly moving about watching this transformation unfold. It is like seeing a starship adjust its trajectory, not because of mechanical failure, but because it has discovered a new destination worth navigating toward. The magnitude remains, but the direction becomes more meaningful. The pace remains, but the purpose gains emotional depth. The ambition remains, but it becomes intertwined with a sense of shared destiny rather than solitary achievement. The hidden chapter also carries a message for the rest of us, that no matter how extraordinary someone's life may appear from the outside, their emotional world is governed by the same laws that govern ours: the desire to be seen, the longing to be understood, the search for someone who brings calm, who brings inspiration, who brings balance. If anything, the more intense someone's life is, the more deeply they feel these needs, and the more significant the transformation when they are finally met. What makes this chapter so compelling is not the scale of the person involved, but the scale of the shift occurring within them. They are no longer driven only by planetary-level problems. They are driven by something intimate, personal, beautifully human. The future they are building becomes intertwined with the future they imagine with someone else. And that fusion, that merging of global impact and personal connection, produces a kind of clarity that is incredibly rare. Because when love enters a powerful mind, it doesn't reduce its brilliance, it refines it, it directs it, it gives it a heartbeat. And that heartbeat becomes the silent metronome guiding everything that follows. And over time, that subtle rhythm begins to influence decisions in ways both profound and invisible. It slows impulses that once raced unchecked. It tempers risks that once felt effortless. It sharpens instincts that were already extraordinary. And most importantly, it shifts the internal narrative from "I must build this" to "I want to build a future worthy of the person I love." That change may appear small in language, but in neuroscience, it is massive. It alters dopamine pathways, reshapes motivational hierarchies, and expands the brain's capacity for long-term thinking grounded not only in ambition, but in devotion. As this transformation deepens, something else emerges: an emotional clarity that many high-level innovators rarely experience. Their lives are often too fast, too intense, too overloaded for self-reflection. But love forces reflection. It becomes a mirror that reveals the parts of themselves they have ignored, the wounds they never tended, the fears they never named, the habits they never questioned. And for someone used to operating with near superhuman efficiency, that kind of introspection can be both jarring and liberating. It is one of the only forces powerful enough to reorient an entire identity without breaking it. In these moments of reflection, the brain begins reorganizing its emotional architecture. Neural pathways associated with avoidance soften. Old defense mechanisms loosen their grip. New circuits dedicated to empathy, reciprocity, and emotional attunement start to strengthen. The mind that once optimized for survival and achievement begins optimizing for connection and meaning. And the most remarkable part is that this happens not through effort, but through presence. The simple, grounding presence of someone whose existence becomes intertwined with your own. This intertwining is not about dependence. It is about resonance. Two emotional systems aligning, reinforcing, stabilizing each other. You see it in the way high-functioning individuals begin to regulate more easily. You hear it in their speech, less clipped, more spacious. You feel it in their energy, less guarded, more open. And you observe it in their decision-making, Still ambitious, still visionary, but with a softness that protects rather than isolates. Eventually, this shift reaches a point where the internal and external worlds begin to mirror each other. The person who once measured life in goals, timelines, and metrics starts measuring moments, expressions, memories. The person who once lived almost entirely in the future begins living more fully in the present. And this presence becomes a superpower. It deepens intuition. It improves judgment. It creates emotional resilience that no amount of training could replicate. But love does more than stabilize. It elevates. It introduces awe into a life that may have forgotten what awe feels like. Awe is not just an emotion. It is a neurological event. It expands perception. It increases openness to new ideas. It dissolves rigid thinking. And for an innovator, awe is rocket fuel. When that awe is tied to another human being, their mind, their spirit, their laughter, their presence, it amplifies everything. Creativity becomes sharper. Vision becomes clearer. Work feels less like obligation and more like a contribution to a shared future. This emotional elevation also creates a profound shift in priorities. Suddenly, it is not enough for the future to be technologically advanced. It must also be emotionally sustainable. It must be safe. It must be beautiful. It must be worthy. And this shift, from functional to meaningful, influences decisions in ways that ripple outward into industries, relationships, and even global movements. When someone who holds immense influence rediscovers emotional purpose, the world feels it, even if the world never knows the reason. But perhaps the most moving aspect of this hidden chapter is what happens silently, in the private, unrecorded, unpublicized moments between two people. No cameras, no headlines, no shareholders, just presence. The quiet conversations where dreams unfold without fear of misunderstanding. The soft laughter that breaks through tension. The shared stillness that makes even the busiest mind feel at peace. The understanding that does not need words. The gentle grounding that pulls a person back from the edge of burnout or overthinking or solitude. These moments are small, but they are everything. They are the moments that turn an extraordinary life into a human one. And eventually, if the connection is real, truly real, something shifts inside the person who has spent years building worlds at scale. They begin to imagine a world not only for humanity, but for their humanity. Not only for society, but for the person they love. Not only for progress, but for the private life they hope to build. And that hope becomes the quiet anchor beneath every grand ambition. This is the chapter few ever hear about, not because it is hidden out of shame, but because it is sacred. It is the one part of life that cannot be engineered, cannot be optimized, cannot be reversed, designed from the outside. It must be lived, felt, protected. And when someone finally allows themselves to live it, they discover a truth more profound than any scientific breakthrough, that the heart, in all its unpredictability, is the most advanced technology the human species has ever possessed. It is adaptive, it is intuitive, it is resilient, and when it connects deeply with another, it becomes capable of guiding even the greatest minds toward a more balanced, meaningful, and human future. And so, when a billionaire falls in love, truly deeply, quietly, the world changes a little, not because the public sees it, not because it makes headlines, not because it influences markets, but because a mind capable of extraordinary creation becomes grounded in extraordinary emotion. And that combination, rare as it is, produces a kind of human brilliance that no wealth, no title, no invention could ever replicate. In the end, what matters is not the magnitude of one's achievements, but the depth of one's connections, not the scale of one's influence, but the sincerity of one's heart. And as the hidden chapter unfolds, as love continues to weave itself into the architecture of a visionary mind, a new kind of strength emerges, a strength that is not loud, not sharp, not fueled by adrenaline or ambition, a strength born from tenderness, stability, presence, devotion, a strength that whispers, "You are no longer building the future alone." And with that realization, everything, absolutely everything, begins to change. Because once the mind grasps that its journey is no longer a solitary ascent, a profound reorientation begins. The internal monologue shifts. The relentless self-driven momentum softens into something collaborative, something shared. And for someone who has spent their entire life believing that carrying the world alone was the only path forward, this revelation is almost revolutionary. They begin to understand that companionship is not a liability, it is a form of emotional propulsion. It fuels them in ways efficiency never could. It steadies them in moments when logic falters. It reminds them that even the greatest visions are built on the foundation of human connection. With this shift comes a new kind of courage. Not the bold, public courage of launching rockets or reshaping industries, but the quiet courage of allowing oneself to be fully seen. High-achieving individuals often armor themselves with competence. They hide behind their responsibilities, their brilliance, their schedules. But love strips away the armor, gently, patiently, until the person beneath is no longer just a symbol or a leader, but a human being with fears, hopes, doubts, and dreams. And the remarkable thing is that instead of weakening them, this exposure strengthens them. It gives them emotional integrity. It gives them depth. It gives them the freedom to express the parts of themselves that were once buried beneath relentless expectation. As this emotional transparency grows, so does another transformation, the ability to envision a future, not only in terms of technological advancement, but in terms of emotional fulfillment. They begin to imagine mornings shared instead of mornings rushed, conversations that nourish instead of brief status updates, a partner who understands their silences, their storms, their inner calculations, someone who doesn't need them to be larger than life, only present, authentic, and sincere. This shift from performance to presence is one of the most extraordinary psychological evolutions any human can undergo, and it becomes even more profound when it unfolds inside a mind accustomed to the extraordinary. Slowly, the brain learns to hold two realities at once: the vastness of global ambition and the intimacy of personal connection. This duality does not diminish capability, it enhances it. A person grounded in love is often more mentally agile, more emotionally balanced, more creative, and more capable of sustained innovation. They take better risks because they take fewer reckless ones. They see more clearly because their vision is no longer fogged by emotional deprivation. They lead more compassionately because they finally know firsthand the power of being cared for. And as their internal world stabilizes, something else becomes possible: trust. This might sound simple, but for people operating at extraordinary levels, trust is often the most difficult emotional state to access. So many individuals orbit them with hidden motives, shallow intentions, or performative loyalty. But when love is real, truly real, the brain recognizes it. It relaxes. It stops scanning for danger. It stops anticipating betrayal. And this neural quieting allows genuine intimacy to grow. The person no longer feels like they are standing alone at the top of an impossibly tall mountain. Instead, they feel accompanied, not by someone climbing behind them, but by someone climbing beside them. This companionship becomes a kind of emotional gravity. It keeps them centered. It keeps them anchored. It keeps them human. And in a world where high achievers are constantly at risk of drifting into isolation, this grounding force is invaluable. It transforms ambition from a lonely pursuit into a shared mission. It turns victories into celebrations rather than milestones. It turns challenges into opportunities for deeper connection rather than deeper stress. In this space of shared humanity, another powerful realization begins to take shape: that love is not the opposite of strength, but the refinement of it. Strength without connection becomes rigidity. Strength with connection becomes wisdom. And wisdom, true wisdom, is the ability to understand not only how to build a world, but how to live in it. With this new wisdom, a subtle yet profound maturity emerges. The person begins to make decisions not from a place of pressure, but from a place of clarity. They begin to communicate with more patience, more empathy, more depth. They begin to feel gratitude not only for what they have created, but for who they have become in the process. and they begin to appreciate the rare gift of having someone who sees them not as a symbol or a titan or a savior, but simply as a person, flawed, extraordinary, evolving. In this final stage of the hidden chapter, the emotional transformation becomes complete. The mind that once ran exclusively on logic now runs on a beautiful synthesis of logic and emotion. The heart that once guarded itself behind layers of responsibility now beats with openness. The life that once revolved entirely around global purpose now includes personal meaning woven into every aspiration. And from this integration arises one of the most profound gifts of all: peace. Not complacency, not slowness, not a loss of ambition, but a quiet, steady peace that strengthens rather than softens. A peace that allows them to breathe deeply without fear of interruption. A peace that reminds them that the future they are building is not only technologically advanced, but emotionally grounded. A peace that gives them the courage to love fully, even in the face of uncertainty. And so, the hidden chapter ends not with fireworks, nor with dramatic revelation, but with something far more powerful: a human being who has finally discovered that no matter how vast their influence, how grand their mission, or how extraordinary their mind, their greatest evolution begins not in the stars but in the heart. Because in the end, after all the breakthroughs, all the battles, all the triumphs and all the turbulence, what remains is simple: the people we love, the connections that shape us, and the quiet truth that even the greatest minds become greater when they finally allow themselves to feel deeply. That is the chapter the world never sees, but it is the chapter that changes everything. And even when the chapter feels complete, the story itself continues, not because more must be written, but because love creates an ongoing evolution, rather than a final destination. Once a mind has opened in this way, once the heart has accepted its own capacity for connection, there is no going back to the old architecture. The operating system has changed permanently. Life becomes richer in its quiet moments, deeper in its reflections, more intentional in its choices. Ambition is no longer a race, it becomes a contribution. Success is no longer a shield, it becomes a responsibility to protect the people who give life meaning. In this sustained transformation, something extraordinary happens. The person begins to understand the difference between achievement and fulfillment. Achievement is external, measurable, visible, celebrated. Fulfillment is internal, silent, steady, nourishing. And though the world may never witness this internal shift, its effects radiate outward into everything they create, every decision they make, every interaction they have. A person who feels loved builds a world with more compassion. A person who feels supported leads with more humanity. A person who feels understood listens more deeply. And through that listening, they discover truths they once overlooked. This emotional grounding also brings a new kind of resilience. Not the sharp-edged resilience forged through hardship, but the gentle, sustaining resilience born from being seen and supported. Challenges sting less. Failures feel less fatal. Stress loses its power to consume. The brain, now accustomed to emotional balance, refuses to return to a state of constant tension. It seeks equilibrium, it seeks honesty, it seeks connection. And because of this, even the most demanding responsibilities become easier to navigate. The hidden chapter becomes not a single moment, but a lens, a way of perceiving the world that blends intellect with intuition, ambition with affection, innovation with humanity. The person becomes more nuanced, more whole, more humanly powerful. They begin to understand that their legacy is not only the technologies they build, but the emotional world they nurture. They begin to recognize that the future is not shaped only by ideas, but by the people who inspire those ideas. And gradually, without fanfare, the person reaches a kind of emotional altitude they have never experienced before. High enough to see the world clearly, grounded enough to feel it deeply, confident enough to move forward without fear of losing themselves, open enough to receive love without questioning whether they deserve it. This is where the true beauty of the transformation lies, in the newfound balance between strength and softness, ambition and vulnerability, vision and presence. It is a balance that cannot be taught, engineered, or forced. It must be lived. It must be felt. It must be earned through the courage to let someone in. And in the quiet moments, when the world's noise fades and only two hearts remain, the person finally understands the simplest truth of all, that even the greatest life feels incomplete until it is shared, that even the most brilliant mind becomes brighter in the presence of love, and that even the most extraordinary future becomes more meaningful when it includes someone who walks beside you, not behind you, not beneath you, but with you. So the journey continues, shaped not by headlines or expectations, but by the delicate, steady force of human connection. A force that softens the sharp edges of ambition, a force that steadies the restless mind, a force that reminds even the most powerful individuals that they are, at their core, human, wired for love, shaped by emotion, strengthened by companionship. And as they move forward with this new wisdom, they carry within them a quiet certainty that the greatest chapter of their life is not the one the world documents, but the one the heart writes in silence. And from that silence, a new future begins, clearer, warmer, more grounded, and more human than ever before.